Right. Apollo 8. We're diving deep into it today, eh? Not just any old space mission, this one.
No, not at all. This was humanity poking its nose beyond Earth's gravity for the first time, orbiting another celestial body, the moon, no less.
A big moment then for our species and all that, and for our listeners who, well, we know they like to get to the heart of things quickly.
We'll be extracting the essence, so to speak.
Okay.
Goals, outcomes, and that rather surprising chain of events that led to Apollo 8's lunar orbit.
Without drowning anyone in technical jargon.
Precisely.
We've got quite the stack of mission reports and analyses to sift through, wouldn't you say?
Indeed, a comprehensive collection. Our mission, if you will, is to really dissect Apollo 8, understand its objectives, follow its timeline, and grasp why it's such a pivotal point in the history of spaceflight.
Right then. Context first, I suppose. Late 1950s, bleeding into the 60s. The Cold War was in full swing, wasn't it?
A period of immense rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, absolutely.
Yeah.
Defining the geopolitical landscape, you could say.
And then the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 in 1957. That little satellite caused quite the stir.
The Sputnik crisis, as it became known, it wasn't just that they'd put something in orbit. It was the implication, the technological prowess it demonstrated, particularly in rocketry.
The Americans felt a bit, well, less behind, didn't they? And thus began the space race.
A full-blown competition for supremacy in space. And of course, President Kennedy made that famous declaration.
American preeminence in space. And to really hammer it home, that rather ambitious goal of landing a man on the moon before the decade was out.
Bold statement indeed. And the Apollo program, which was already underway at that point, was designed with that very goal in mind.
And a crucial early decision was to use what they called lunar orbit rendezvous.
Instead of landing the entire behemoth of a spacecraft, they opted for a smaller lander, the lunar module, or LM, to shuttle down to the surface while the main craft remained in orbit. Far more efficient in terms of fuel and weight.
So not a direct descent then?
No. This approach necessitated a three-part spacecraft. The command module, where the astronauts would live and which would eventually return to Earth. The service module, providing propulsion, power, and other necessities. And of course, the lunar module.
All sitting atop that colossal Saturn V rocket, which itself was still very much in development.
Correct. The initial Apollo plan involved a series of 7 distinct mission types, each building towards the moon landing.
7 steps to the moon, eh? Apollo 8, as we were saying, was originally meant to be a D mission.
Right. These missions had letter designations, each focused on testing specific systems. The D mission was all about testing the lunar module in Earth orbit. This was planned for December of 1968 with a crew led by Jim McDivitt. Frank Borman and his crew, on the other hand, were slotted for the E mission, a more extensive test of the LM in a medium Earth orbit. That would have become Apollo 9, early 69.
So step by step, inching their way towards the ultimate goal. Now, who were these brave souls? The men of Apollo 8.
The prime crew consisted of Frank Borman, the commander, James Lovell, the command module pilot, and William Anders, the lunar module pilot. Interestingly, Lovell had the most flight experience at that point, having flown on 2 previous Gemini missions.
Unusual, isn't it? The commander not being the most experienced.
It was, especially in those early days. The backup crew is worth noting as well. Neil Armstrong as commander, Edwin Buzz Aldrin as command module pilot, and Fred Hayes as lunar module pilot. Names that would, of course, become very familiar soon after.
Household names, in fact. But there was a whole team behind them, wasn't there? A support crew.
Absolutely. Ken Mattingly, Vance Brand, and Gerald Carr for Apollo 8. Their role was vital, keeping schedules, updating checklists, making sure both the prime and backup crews were in the loop about any changes. Lots of simulator time, especially focusing on emergency procedures. Really the unsung heroes, you could say.
And the critical link between the crew in space and everyone back on Earth, the Capcom.
The capsule communicator. The single point of contact, relaying messages back and forth. A rather impressive roster of astronauts served as Capcom for Apollo 8. Michael Collins, Gerald Carr, Ken Mattingly, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Vance Brand, Fred Hayes.
The cream of the crop, as they say. And overseeing the entire operation, we had the flight directors.
3 shifts, each headed by a different flight director. For Apollo 8, those were Clifford Charlesworth, Glenn Lunny, and Milton Windler. Quite the responsibility on their shoulders.
Now, Apollo 8 didn't exactly go as planned, did it? There was a rather significant change in direction.
That's right. As we mentioned, it was initially the D mission, the Earth orbit test of the lunar module. But the development of the LM was running into problems, big problems. When LM-3 arrived at the Kennedy Space Center in June of '68, It had over 100 major defects.
Not exactly ready for prime time then.
No. It became clear that LM-3 wouldn't be flight-ready in 1968, and quite possibly not until well into the next year. This, of course, jeopardized Kennedy's goal of a lunar landing before the end of the decade.
A real dilemma for NASA.
Imagine the pressure. The uncrewed Apollo 6 had already experienced some serious issues. A failure during a crewed launch could have been disastrous, not just for the program's timeline, but for public support as well. This mission wasn't just about reaching the moon. It was about proving that they could do it, that the technology was up to the challenge, and they had to do it quickly.
So what did they do?
Well, in August of '68, George Low, the manager of the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office, made a bold suggestion. He pointed out that the next Command and Service Module, CSM-103, would be ready much sooner than LM-3. So why not send a CSM-only mission to the moon in December? They could even attempt a lunar orbit.
That's quite a jump, skipping ahead several steps in the plan.
It was, but there was sound reasoning behind it. It would allow NASA to test critical procedures like tracking and communication at lunar distances, as well as the performance of the CSM in that environment, things they wouldn't have been able to do until Apollo 10 otherwise.
So keeping the program moving forward despite the setbacks.
Exactly. They could also cancel the E mission, the medium Earth orbit test. Only the D mission would be delayed. They could still aim for a lunar landing in mid-1969 as originally planned.
A calculated risk then?
Indeed. Low first floated the idea with key figures like Bob Gilruth, Chris Kraft, and Donald Slayton, then presented it to a wider group, including Wernher von Braun himself. There was near unanimous agreement. They had faith in the hardware and the people, and the potential morale boost from a successful lunar mission. That was a huge factor as well. Even James Webb, the NASA administrator, was eventually convinced. So Apollo 8 became a C prime mission, a lunar orbit.
And what about the crews, the guys originally slated for the D and E missions? How did they take this change of plan?
Slayton offered the revised Apollo 8 mission to Jim McDivitt, the D mission commander, but McDivitt refused. His crew had been training to test the LM, and that's what they wanted to do. So Slayton decided to swap the prime and backup crews of the two missions. They also swapped the spacecraft. Borman's crew would now use CSM-103. There was a bit of friction, apparently. David Scott, the CMP on McDivitt's crew, wasn't happy about giving up CSM-103, which he'd been closely involved with during testing. And Anders, the LMP on Borman's crew, well, he wasn't thrilled about a lunar mission without a lunar module. But in the end, Apollo 8 would carry a boilerplate LM, a dummy model, just to make sure the weight and balance were correct. And it's amazing to think that this team, carefully selected and trained for a specific mission, ended up doing something radically different. It all came down to George Low's bold idea.
Now, looming over all of this was the Soviet space program. They weren't exactly sitting idle, were they?
Not at all. In September '68, the Soviets launched Zond 5. It was an uncrewed mission, but it carried living organisms, tortoises, insects, plants around the moon and back to Earth. Quite a feat.
A reminder that the Americans weren't alone in this race.
Exactly. There was a real concern that the Soviets might try to launch a crewed circumlunar mission before the end of the year. American intelligence even spotted a mock-up of their N-1 rocket being rolled out. It all added to the pressure.
A sense of urgency then.
Very much so.
Now, there was a rather interesting visitor to the crew the night before the launch.
Yes, Charles Lindbergh, along with his wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh. They spoke about Lindbergh's famous transatlantic flight back in '27, the rudimentary calculations he had to make with basic instruments. Quite a contrast to the technology of Apollo 8. And then the next day, the Lindberghs were there to witness the launch.
Quite a link to aviation history. Now let's talk about the Saturn V rocket itself. It had some teething problems early on, didn't it?
It did. The Saturn V for Apollo 8 was designated AS-503. But the previous uncrewed flight, Apollo 6, had encountered some significant issues. Severe pogo oscillation during the first stage, engine failures in the second stage, and the third stage failed to reignite in orbit. Not exactly confidence-inspiring.
Pogo oscillation? That doesn't sound good. What was that exactly, and how did they fix it?
It's a longitudinal vibration, essentially. A resonance between the engine thrust and the structure of the rocket. It can not only affect engine performance, but also subject the crew to quite a bit of G-force. Not pleasant at all. Teams at the Marshall Space Flight Center worked to solve the problem. They came up with a system that used helium gas to dampen the vibrations. A bit like a shock absorber, I suppose.
And those engine failures on Apollo 6, what caused those?
Investigations revealed a leaking hydrogen fuel line in the second stage. It ruptured when exposed to the vacuum of space, leading to a loss of fuel pressure in one of the engines. Then a miswired connection in the automatic cutoff system caused another engine to shut down prematurely. And there was a similar problem, a faulty igniter line, in the third stage engine. So the engineers modified the fuel lines and the igniter lines to prevent similar issues on future launches.
And of course, they tested these modifications thoroughly.
Absolutely. In August of '68, tests at MSFC showed that the fixes for the pogo oscillation and the fuel line rupture were working as intended. Once the NASA bigwigs were satisfied, they gave the go-ahead for a crewed mission using AS-503. The Apollo 8 space crash was mated to the rocket, and the whole colossal assembly was rolled out to the launch pad in October. And the testing continued right up until the day before launch. Specific tests were conducted to verify the fixes for those earlier problems. A very thorough process, as you can imagine.
Right then, let's get to the mission itself, the timeline, the goals, the outcomes of this groundbreaking venture.
Apollo 8 launched on the 21st of December 1968 at 12:51 UTC. The three stages of the Saturn V performed flawlessly, injecting the spacecraft into an initial Earth parking orbit. The parameters were stud on. Apogee of just under 100 nautical miles, perigee very similar, an inclination of about 32.5 degrees to the equator, and an orbital period of roughly 88 minutes. Basically a standard orbit, just a temporary stop before the big push towards the moon.
And then, of course, the translunar injection burn, the moment they really set off for the moon.
Exactly. After about 2 hours and 44 minutes in Earth orbit, the SIVB third stage reignited for the TLI burn. This lasted 318 seconds, accelerating Apollo 8 to over 35,500 feet per second, a new speed record for human travel relative to Earth. That put them on a trajectory towards the moon.
And then they separated from the spent third stage, a symbolic moment, you could say.
It was. They then turned the spacecraft around to photograph the SIVB. And in doing so, they got the first ever view of the entire Earth from space, an image that would become iconic.
Amazing to think about, isn't it?
It is. Interestingly, Borman got a little worried about the SIVB being too close and requested a separation maneuver. They used the service module's auxiliary thrusters to move further away.
What happened to the SIVB after that?
Mission Control commanded it to vent its remaining fuel, changing its course. It eventually passed by the moon and went into orbit around the sun. It's still out there, a derelict piece of space hardware.
Now, on their way to the moon, they had to pass through the Van Allen radiation belts. That must have been a concern.
It was, yes. These belts, thousands of miles wide, are filled with charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field. Scientists had predicted that the rapid transit through the belts would keep the radiation exposure down to about the level of a chest X-ray, and each crew member wore dosimeters to record the actual dose they received.
So how much radiation did they actually get?
It turned out to be an average of 1.6 milligrays for the entire mission.
And James Lovell had a vital role to play as navigator, didn't he?
He did. While Mission Control normally handled navigation, Lovell had to be able to guide the spacecraft back to Earth if communication was lost. He used a sextant to take star sightings, measuring angles against the Earth's or the moon's horizon. It wasn't easy, though. There was a lot of debris around the spacecraft, making it difficult to identify stars clearly.
And keeping the spacecraft at the right temperature during this long journey must have been a challenge.
It was crucial. They used what was called passive thermal control, or PTC, to maintain a stable temperature. It involves slowly rotating the spacecraft along its long axis, like a chicken on a rotisserie. This ensured that no one side got too hot or too cold from constant exposure to the sun or the darkness of space. It also meant they had to make adjustments every now and then to keep the rotation steady.
And I suppose there were mid-course corrections as well.
The first one came about 11 hours into the mission. A short burn of the Service Propulsion System, or SPS engine, to refine their trajectory. It didn't go quite as planned, though. A helium bubble in the fuel lines caused the engine to underperform slightly, and they had to use the smaller reaction control system thrusters to make up the difference. But interestingly, 2 subsequent mid-course corrections were deemed unnecessary. They were already on such a good trajectory that they didn't need to make any more adjustments.
And during this phase of the mission, Frank Borman became ill, didn't he?
He did. About an hour after taking a sleeping pill, he woke up feeling sick, vomiting, diarrhea, the whole works. Yeah, naturally there was concern. They consulted with medical personnel on the ground, through a recorded message, of course, and the consensus was that it was either a 24-hour bug or a reaction to the medication. Looking back, it might have been a case of space adaptation syndrome.
Now, the world was watching this mission unfold, wasn't it? There were television broadcasts from Apollo 8.
6 in total. The first one, about 31 hours into the mission, was a tour of the spacecraft's interior. They had some trouble pointing the camera properly, though, so they couldn't get a good shot of Earth. But the second broadcast, around 55 hours into the flight, that was a success. They managed to transmit the first television pictures of Earth from space. And they described what they were seeing, the colors, the continents. It was a truly historic moment for those watching back home.
Now, as Apollo 8 approached the moon, they crossed a significant threshold, didn't they?
Yes, at about 55 hours and 40 minutes into the mission, Apollo 8 became the first crewed spacecraft to enter the gravitational sphere of influence of another celestial body. The moon's gravity became the dominant force, pulling them in.
And then came the lunar orbit insertion burn, the LOI burn, the moment of truth.
Absolutely. LOI-1, as it was called, had to be executed perfectly. And to make things even more tense, it had to be done while they were on the far side of the moon, out of contact with Earth. They got confirmation from Mission Control just before disappearing behind the moon, and then silence. The SPS engine ignited as planned, burning for over 4 minutes, putting Apollo 8 into an elliptical lunar orbit. They later said those were the longest 4 minutes of their lives.
I bet Mission Control was holding its breath.
I'm sure they were. They were completely blind, relying on the spacecraft to do its job. If the burn hadn't gone right, they could have flown past the moon or crashed into it. But then, right on schedule, the signal reappeared. Relief, I imagine, all around. And Lovell gave the first human description of the lunar surface. Grayish, heavily cratered.
One of the main objectives of the mission was lunar reconnaissance, wasn't it?
It was, especially of potential landing sites for future missions, including the planned Apollo 11 landing site in the Sea of Tranquility. The timing of the launch had been chosen to provide the best lighting for this purpose. Bill Anders spent a lot of his time photographing and filming the moon's surface.
And there were further orbital adjustments, I believe.
Yes, after their second pass in front of the moon, they fired the SPS engine again. This was LOI-2, which circularized the orbit to an altitude of about 70 by 71 miles. Throughout their time in lunar orbit, Borman paid close attention to the SPS engine. He wanted to make sure it was ready to fire again if they needed to make an early return to Earth, just in case.
And during their third orbit, Frank Borman did something rather personal, didn't he?
He did. He recited a short prayer for his church back home. He had been scheduled to participate in a service, but obviously he couldn't make it. So a fellow parishioner suggested he record a prayer to be played during the service.
And then came that iconic moment, Earthrise.
On their fourth pass over the near side of the moon, as they came around from behind the lunar limb, they saw it. The Earth rising above the horizon. The first humans to witness this sight. Anders took that now famous color photograph, Earthrise, one of the most influential images ever taken. It's worth noting that because of the moon's synchronous rotation, you wouldn't normally see Earthrise from the lunar surface. It's a phenomenon you see primarily from orbit. And that image, for those listening, it really changed how we saw ourselves. It was the first time we looked back at our planet from a distance, a fragile blue marble hanging in the void. It solidified the concept of Earth as one interconnected ecosystem, a concept that really took hold in the years that followed.
A powerful image indeed.
It was.
But by this point, the crew must have been pretty tired.
Exhausted, actually. Borman realized everyone was running on fumes, having had very little proper rest for over 3 days. So he decided to let Anders and Lovell get some sleep. They even skipped some of the planned lunar observation activities, though he made sure a camera was set up to continue taking automatic photographs.
And then on Christmas Eve came the Genesis reading.
As they came around the moon for the 9th time, they began their second television broadcast from lunar orbit. After sharing their impressions of the moon, Anders announced that they had a message for everyone back on Earth. Each of the 3 astronauts then read a passage from the book of Genesis, the biblical creation story. Borman ended the broadcast with Christmas greetings and a benediction. It's estimated that a quarter of the world's population watched that broadcast.
An incredible reach.
It was.
And after that, the focus shifted to the return journey.
Right. The next critical step was the Trans-Earth Injection Burn, or TEI. This was the engine firing needed to break free of lunar orbit and set course for home. Again, it had to be done on the far side of the moon, out of contact with ground control. But the SPS engine ignited right on time, and as the spacecraft reappeared, Lovell famously announced, "Please be informed, there is a Santa Claus." A bit of levity after a tense moment.
But the trip back wasn't entirely smooth sailing, was it?
There was one incident. Lovell, during some downtime, accidentally erased part of the computer's memory while trying to take some navigational sightings. This caused the Inertial Measurement Unit, the IMU, to get confused about the spacecraft's orientation, and the thrusters fired to correct it. Lovell had to manually realign the spacecraft using star sightings, a procedure he'd later have to repeat under far more critical circumstances during Apollo 13.
A bit of a foreshadowing that.
You could say that. It really shows the importance of their training and their ability to think on their feet. Imagine having to rely on your memory of star charts after days in space, with the fate of the mission in your hands.
The rest of the journey back was fairly uneventful, wasn't it?
It was, relatively speaking. They had time to rest, monitor the systems, and even do a couple more television broadcasts. One of them, on Christmas Day, was a tour of their living quarters in space. Deke Slayton had even arranged a surprise Christmas dinner for them. Turkey, cranberry sauce, the works. And there were miniature brandy bottles, though Borman wisely told them to wait until they were safely back on Earth before opening those. The final television transmission included the best video images of Earth they captured during the mission.
And then came the fiery re-entry into Earth's atmosphere.
The re-entry sequence was controlled by the onboard computer. The command module separated from the service module and oriented itself for atmospheric entry, heat shield first. As they plunged into the upper atmosphere, a plasma sheath formed around the spacecraft, creating a luminous glow. Deceleration peaked at about 6 Gs. The spacecraft briefly skipped off the atmosphere like a stone on water before continuing its descent towards the Pacific Ocean. Drogue parachutes deployed at 30,000 feet, followed by the main parachutes at 10,000 feet.
And splashed out.
It occurred in the North Pacific, southwest of Hawaii. The command module initially landed upside down in what they called the Stable 2 configuration. Borman actually got a bit seasick while they waited for the flotation bags to inflate and right the spacecraft. About 6 minutes later, it flipped over into the normal Stable 1 position. Recovery teams from the USS Yorktown were there quickly, and the astronauts were safely aboard the carrier within 45 minutes of splashdown. A successful end to a truly daring and unprecedented mission.
So what was the lasting impact of Apollo 8? It came at the end of a rather turbulent year, 1968.
A year of global unrest, assassinations, war. Apollo 8 provided a much-needed moment of hope, a shared sense of accomplishment. Time magazine recognized this by naming the crew Men of the Year for 1968. They were the first humans to leave Earth's gravity well and orbit another celestial body, a mission that, by their own admission, carried significant risks. And perhaps the sentiment was best summed up in a telegram Borman received. Thank you, Apollo 8, you saved 1968.
And that Earthrise photograph, it had a profound impact as well, didn't it?
It did. It gave us a new perspective on our planet, highlighting its fragility and interconnectedness. It's widely considered one of the inspirations for the first Earth Day in 1970. Life magazine even included it in their list of 100 photographs that changed the world.
And even fellow astronauts and space historians have emphasized the importance of Apollo 8.
Michael Collins called it the most important flight of the program, historically speaking. And Robert K. Poole went even further, calling it the most historically significant of all the Apollo missions. The mission received massive media coverage worldwide, almost on par with John Glenn's first orbital flight. And that Christmas Eve broadcast, it reached a huge global audience. It even won an Emmy Award.
There was a bit of controversy surrounding the Genesis reading, wasn't there?
There was. Madeleine Murray O'Hair, the atheist activist, filed a lawsuit against NASA, arguing that the reading of Genesis by government employees while in space violated the separation of church and state. The Supreme Court eventually dismissed the lawsuit, but it did make NASA a bit more cautious about religious observances on subsequent Apollo missions. Buzz Aldrin, for example, took communion privately on the moon during Apollo 11, but he didn't publicize it at the time.
But the mission was also commemorated in a more official way.
Yes, in 1969, the U.S. Post Office issued a commemorative stamp featuring the Earthrise photograph and the opening words of Genesis. And the crew even made an appearance at Super Bowl III shortly after their return.
And where are the pieces of this historic mission today?
The Apollo 8 command module is on display at the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. Jim Lovell's Apollo 8 spacesuit is at NASA's Glenn Research Center, and Bill Anders' suit is at the Science Museum in London.
And its legacy continues in popular culture.
It does. It's been the subject of numerous films, documentaries, even music. It continues to inspire and fascinate even today.
So, to sum it all up, Apollo 8 achieved a truly monumental feat, the first crewed orbit of the moon. It paved the way for the eventual lunar landing, gave us those iconic images that changed how we see our planet, and offered a moment of unity and hope during a turbulent time.
Absolutely. And it provided crucial operational knowledge about lunar orbits, laying the groundwork for all future lunar missions.
It's incredible to think about the audacity and ambition of it all. Sending humans to orbit the moon in the late 1960s with the technology they had then, it really makes you wonder, what challenges today inspire that same kind of bold, even audacious action? Food for thought, I suppose. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Apollo 8. And do explore the sources and details of this remarkable mission further in your own time. It's a story worth revisiting.
Indeed.
Until next time, then.